Let me just introduce the panel to start off with. First on my right here, Lisa Davis, and Lisa is the Chief Executive Officer with Peartree Securities. Now, Lisa, if I remember rightly, is it now nearly $1 billion or so flow through that you've invested and helped invest?
Over $1 billion and going strong.
So no small change, and we're going to examine a little bit about responsible mining in the future and what that means for the investors and how the investors are changing. Then further along, we have Sandra Gogal, and she's a partner and Aboriginal leader with Milner Thomson LLP. And I think it's the second year in a row, Sandra, that we've done this. And again, in terms of responsible mining worldwide, Indigenous relations and local communities is increasingly important. And I know that you've done some very leading work in that area. And then on the end, to round off the panel, Aidan Davies, and Aidan is the Chief Operating Officer for the International Council of Mines and Metals, and Aidan's council there represents well over 20 of the world's leading mining companies, and I think well over 60% of annual production of most metals and minerals, and they get together throughout the year, and we'll hear from Aidan in terms of what is on the minds of leading companies throughout the world. But we find ourselves in a very interesting space, as we did hear from Ross, and increasingly we're finding a confluence of pressures on the mining industry. I think for the first time what we're also seeing is consumers pushing all the way from essentially the shop floor, the supermarket if you like, all the way back to producers. We now are seeing at conferences, for example, at BMO in Florida this year, people like BMW coming into the audience, wanting to actually visit and go to the mine gates and to see that the products, the aluminum or the nickel or the cobalt, is actually being mined in a fair and responsible manner. Consumers, for example, don't wish to have coltan, cobalt, tantalum, that is in their iPhones that's being mined by seven-year-old slave children. They want to be ensured that the metallic paint on their cars, the micas, for example, again, mined in India. There's been a big case where this was also exposed as being mined by seven-year-old children. So people who are buying their BMWs, and BMWs, in fact, don't want to be embarrassed in that way. So there's a lot coming together. We're seeing activism of shareholders. We're seeing activism of communities, saying that they want their fair share. So let's start off. And Aidan, I'd like to start off with you. At the ICMM, some leading companies, some leading thoughts. What is on the minds of the leaders of our industry, those that are representing the large companies, Glencore, Anglo American, and so on?
Yeah, look, thanks for the question, Andrew. And I guess before diving into talking about sort of what's on their minds and what are they doing about it, I want to say a little bit about some of the drivers that's really shaping the response from the industry. And, there's kind of three that I want to touch upon. And the first of those is what I refer to as the rise in the ethical consuming-facing companies. There was a lot of discussion some years ago about this notion of an ethical consumer. And in fact, in the UK, we have a magazine called Ethical Consumer, and it's celebrating its 30th anniversary next year. But I think it's fair to say that the ethical consumer, up until fairly recently, has been fairly elusive and has also been fairly weak in terms of kind of purchasing power. And that's changing profoundly. And what we're seeing now, I think, is the rise in ethical consumer-facing companies. And this is partly motivated by legislative pressures and NGO advocacy activity, both in the US and Europe. But we are seeing many, many companies, I think, adopting an increasingly assertive approach to the notion of responsible sourcing, driven by some of these campaigns. So companies like Apple, Intel, BMW, and others, they're increasingly concerned that only responsibly mined products are used in the production of what they ultimately pass on to consumers. And this has resulted in several initiatives, some of them commodity-specific, some of them cross-commodity, that are really aimed at trying to ensure that materials supplied to companies that care about these things have been produced responsibly. One of the ones that I think is noteworthy is the Responsible Minerals Initiative, and that's a coalition of about 130 major automotive and electronics companies. And they've collectively come together to try and define what are the social and environmental issues that they want to see responsibly managed. How would companies go about doing that to aim to eliminate those risks from their supply chains. So I think the companies that can demonstrate that they responsibly produce metals and minerals face a real opportunity, and those that can't, there is the risk of an existential threat. What we're doing in ICMM currently with our members is to try and define a clear and comprehensive set of what we're referring to as performance expectations, which really set out a benchmark of what responsible practices would look like at the operational level. The idea being that our member companies, 25 of the world's leading mining and metals companies, would look to implement those across their portfolios of operations, but also that other responsible mining and metals companies could embrace that approach as well. So that, I think, is one big trend. Second thing, climate change. It remains a strategically important issue for the industry. And I think, we've seen this shift as well from a perspective around risk and resilience to one of opportunity, which has been really positive. And so in terms of risk, companies are concerned that their portfolios are not subject to risks associated with diminishing water supplies in water scarce environments, or increased incidences of extreme weather events that may have an impact on business disruption. But equally, I think what we're seeing in the last few years is the conversation has shifted from one of operational risk to one of financial risk. So you may be aware the Financial Stability Board, which was established in the wake of the global financial crisis, has a task force on climate-related financial disclosures established 3-4 years ago with Governor Mark Carney as the head of the initiative. The TCFD, as it's called, that reported out last year, and in the final report, it basically said that companies should transparency price climate-related risks into their allocation of capital and disclose that to insurers, to lenders, and to investors. And so from a practical perspective, what they are expecting to see is that kind of disclosure taking place in the public filings of companies. That, I think, is potentially a risk, but there is a huge upside opportunity here for the industry, because from an opportunity perspective, metals and minerals are going to play an incredibly important role in the transition to a low-carbon economy. The technologies that will see us through to that space are metals and minerals intensive. And so, we've read, and you've alluded to, moves by automotive manufacturers, electronics companies, and others to try and secure long-term supply of responsibly produced minerals or metals. So my expectation is that companies that they are able to demonstrate we are responsibly supplying these materials will be beneficiaries, and they will win out in the long term. So that I see as an extraordinary opportunity area. At ICMM, we've done some work along with the World Bank to try and understand the growing role of metals and minerals in that transition to a low-carbon economy. And we're also currently working with some of the world's leading original equipment manufacturers to try and say, okay, well, how can we collaborate to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions from mobile equipment through innovation and through the adoption of new technologies? And then, if I may, just one last kind of trend I think that is incredibly important is the growing expectation that mining has a developmental role to play. So in 2015, 193 governments through the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and these cover a diverse set of issues relating to climate, water, education, gender, etc. It sets out a blueprint for development for the next, at that time, 15 years, but to 2030. I guess metals and minerals have an incredibly important role to play in the realization of many of the SDGs, but at the same time, I think the legitimacy of the industry is being challenged. And in particular, conflicts around natural resource projects are becoming more prevalent. We have research that backs it up. I won't go into the numbers, but certainly the sense is that they are becoming more prevalent. So when I talk about conflict, when you really boil it down, it comes down to two main factors. The first is it's around contested perspectives over the ownership of subsurface resources. So most governments have declared ownership of subsurface resources in the interests of the citizenry. Understandably, the communities that live above those resources feel a degree of ownership of what lies beneath their lands. And invariably, companies that pay to acquire the rights to develop those feel a sense of ownership. The second challenge is competing perspectives over the locus of decision-making. most governments self-identify as the arbiters of whether or not development should proceed and how. But increasingly, citizens around mining projects are demanding a voice, particularly when government is either remote or often absent. And so I think where those two factors collide, you often get to a situation of conflict. For me, this suggests a need to explore new approaches over the next decade. And something that we've talked about at ICMM in the past is this notion of a social contract of mining. In practice, what that might mean is that this sets out not just the benefits that the different parties should get, but what are the reciprocal obligations of government, companies and civil society if you were to develop those projects more harmoniously. I'm going to stop there.
But Aidan, you have set us up beautifully here to move over to Sandra, and we haven't planned this, by the way. But that's an amazing segue, Sandra, into local communities, indigenous people. This is where you spend your life, and the intersection of those communities with the mining industry. If I remember correctly, Mark Cutifani quoted a couple of years ago that about $25 billion of assets or projects are not moving forward because of conflict with communities. Maybe with that, I can hand it over to you. So from the community perspective, what do you think?
So I think if we define responsible mining in terms of social and environmental best practices, from my perspective in the work that I've been doing, there is a real genuine desire and willingness on part of industry, which is the clients that I represent, to actually work with the Indigenous populations and to develop environmental practices that go above and beyond even what the regulatory requirements are. And when you look at the efforts that are made to engage with the Indigenous communities, they are above and beyond the legal requirements, and they're moving more towards like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Many companies now are looking to incorporate that as part of their framework, their corporate policy, and therefore make their decisions accordingly. And the projects are really being developed in a manner that is respectful of traditional land use by Indigenous peoples, that are incorporating traditional knowledge on an equal footing with Western science, and as well as developing these social agreements, like you've mentioned, that sees a revenue stream and long-lasting results to communities for the life of the project. And even now, more creative, I'm finding, and here's a couple of examples of projects that I'm just working on right now, whereby the company has developed a tailings management board, which is made up of equal representation of Indigenous peoples that are affected by the project, the company representatives and independent experts and technicians to manage the tailings pond for the entire life of the project. And that addresses that sense of loss of control or non-equal decision-making on project development. And knowing that they're in an area that is usually where most of the concerns are identified is around tailings management. The other interesting development that we're seeing more is a joint environmental panel that's actually formed in parallel to the existing regulatory structures and processes that are in place. And this panel then would be made up of Indigenous leaders and decision makers, as well as companies appearing before them to assess the project and the impacts on their rights, and then as a result of that, forming recommendations that will feed into the ministerial regulated process. So, from the work that I've been doing, I've been seeing lots of progress in the area of responsible mining, for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Lisa, just to bring you in here, $1 billion in Canada flow through. This is money that goes onto the ground. It's largely going into the communities that Sandra's talking about. When you're raising the money and you're talking with the investors, those that are, as the saying goes, putting a hand to wallet reflex, what are you seeing? Are you seeing any changes these days in terms of responsible investing? Has the conversation started to change?
Yeah, we actually have been seeing some change, and I think that's attributable in part to the change in how exploration and development financing in Canada is being done. If you go back 5 or 7 years ago, there was a much more sort of disparate group of retail investors, albeit a lot of them through limited partnerships. But what's actually happened in more recent years is that there's been a real transformation, and actually the platform that Peartree developed is now the largest conduit of funds coming into exploration financing in junior Canadian companies. So the business that we're in actually is a hybrid business that's linked very much to philanthropy, and the groups that are the source of capital for us, for the most part, are high net worth and ultra high net worth families that are multi-generational. And as we get down to the younger generations, we are starting to see more questions being asked about how funds are being used. And while we do some financing in oil and gas, there seems to be more pushback against oil and gas, whether that's valid or not, I don't know. But with mining, I think it's a conversation, and it's usually a successful conversation in which there's an understanding that Canadian standards actually are high, and there is a willingness, as you said, to mine responsibly, and there are a lot of benefits for northern development, for economic opportunity for Indigenous communities, and so that conversation usually goes well. The other thing I think that we're seeing is that similarly in sort of the transformation in the way that funding is getting done in this sector, is that there's been a lot more strategic investment by producers into junior exploration companies in Canada. So we've worked with companies like Barrick and Kinross that are putting money into junior companies who, I would say, not that they're doing anything harmful, but maybe wouldn't be as progressive as some of the more mature companies that have really thought through some of these CSR issues. And in evaluating investments, if you're a Gold Corp or that kind of a company, your sort of criteria and the scorecard you use in evaluating includes some of the things that you've developed as a more mature company. So that's, I think, having a little bit of influence. And I think the last thing I would say is that I'm seeing more sort of indirect pressure from kind of advocacy groups that are disappointed that the sector that we're dealing in maybe aren't being as progressive as they could be. As a matter of fact, a recent example, I was at the launch of something called the Canadian Gender and Good Governance Alliance a couple of weeks ago, and I think particularly in the junior space where that some of the existential issues are paramount and are not maybe thinking as progressively on certain fronts as they otherwise could, but because of some progress in areas like gender parity and diversity and inclusion not really moving as quickly, particularly in the junior space, as a lot of people would like to see happen, organizations like this are coming together and saying things aren't happening quickly enough, and if they don't change voluntarily, I think we might see the imposition of rules and regulations. There's talk of things like quotas for women on boards and that sort of thing. So I think it's sort of in everyone's interest to maybe control the process and start thinking more progressively before these things become mandated.
Yeah, so it's a really important point, Lisa. I mean, just as a quick an aside, Parliament Square had its first female statue put on it yesterday.
Yes.
111 years later, but there we are. But this is a very important point. I mean, we've talked about the money side of things, but I'd love to just build on what you've talked about, the people side of it. The millennials, we're of an age, I think, where our children are either in their teens or they're in their 20s, and they're certainly, I'm picking up, don't wish to work for an uncool industry. They don't wish to work for an unethical industry. And there's the money is from the baby boomers, the older generation moves in family trusts, which you're dealing with, moves to those younger generations. Are you seeing, how would you describe that awareness coming through?
You know what, maybe I'll sort of answer with my PDAC hat on as a director and co-chair of the Finance and Taxation Committee. There's been a lot of discussion recently of actually this just coming to the end of a 5-year strategic planning process. And I think that, and it was mentioned actually by Ross Beatty when he spoke, I mean, the perceptions or misconceptions about the industry, they seem to be stories that are told by those that are anti-mining industry. And I think that we just sort of seem to see the same thing over and over again, that there's just kind of a generally bad perception that seems to be, those are the stories that are getting out there.
Yeah.
And I think the industry associations and others that can have some influence have really got to get better at telling the good stories and talking about how responsibly the industry is behaving out of Canada. Not that there aren't accidents or there aren't the odd bad actor or anything like that, but certainly I think that if good, responsible Canadian companies adhering to high standards aren't the ones that are going to be looking for and developing mines, somebody else is going to step in and do it, and probably not, be as mindful of the things that are important. So I think somehow we've got to really get that to the top of the agenda, learn to tell our stories a little bit better, our good stories.
And I'd like to skip straight from that to you, Aidan, because I know from my previous involvement with ICMM, this was an issue of great angst with many of the CEOs. What's happening in terms of getting the story of mining out there that perhaps we're no longer the industry of the 1950s? It's a cool place to be.
I think Lisa makes an incredibly important point because, as an industry, I think we've been pretty bad about telling the positive stories. And look, I think you've got to be self-reflective about this as an organisation that works on issues related to sustainability and responsible mining. ICMM has not been particularly good at telling those stories either. I think our primary focus for the first 10 years or so of our existence, we've been around now for about 15 years, was really trying to bring to the marketplace, if you like, a whole series of guidance documents that would give practical expression to the principles that the member companies that are part of ICMM established at our foundation. And so I think, very, very strong focus on how do we bring to life statements almost of aspiration and make it practical for what companies can do on the ground. But I think gradually we started to shift into a space of recognizing that unless we begin to tell an alternative story and create a different narrative around what mining means, then there is a risk that people just don't begin to recognize or acknowledge the good the industry does. And so we're currently in the second year of a pilot campaign to really try and talk about what we refer to as mining with principles. And at the core of that mining with principles campaign is a demonstration that not just are metals and minerals critically important to modern living, but increasingly those metals and minerals are being produced in a really responsible way. And the latest part of that campaign has been to try and show how that is actually profoundly impacting upon the lives of people in the host communities where mining takes place. So a lot of work to do. We're just I would say we're dipping our toes in the water. I suspect Carl from Brunswick would echo that is dipping our toes in the water. There's more to do, but I think it's showing promising signs of having some traction.
And Sandra, would you agree? I mean, one of the things is that we talk about a trust deficit, and if we're talking about responsible mining in the future, we obviously want to have enhanced trust. What are the communities saying to you?
Well, it's interesting because I agree that the perception is not sort of the reality in which I practice, because I see all the great things that mining industry does when we negotiate these agreements. And perhaps, the challenge and part of the problem is that these agreements are confidential, right? So, nobody quite knows how much money is actually flowing into the communities, how much say and negotiations and consultation and engagement that's actually have taken place years before even your project description gets filed. And these boards and bodies around decision making, the contracts, the procurement opportunities. I mean, we're working with the community now, and we're looking to jointly develop a power supply to the mine, right? I mean, we could do it ourselves for a lot cheaper, but we're looking at giving the equity to the community so that they then have the project after the mine is gone 15 years from there. And those are the stories, unfortunately, that don't get shared because of the confidentiality around these agreements. And now there's a new piece of legislation, well, it's not new anymore actually, which is the Extractive Sector Transparency Measures Act. And within that, companies now have to disclose, if it's greater than $99,000 a year, you have to disclose payments that are being made to Aboriginal governments. So eventually, I think that at least the dollars, will become more recognized or more public around what we're doing with the communities. And the other sort of thing that we're trying to do is when there is a deal that is reached and it is positive for both sides, and well, if you have a deal, generally it is seen as positive, that both the company and the communities jointly announce it, joint press release, and do things in the community so that the communities know, because unfortunately the only ones you hear about are the projects that are opposed on the ground because they hit the front page. But usually there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes as to why that's the case.
Yeah. You mentioned some groundbreaking legislation from Canada. Of course, last year, or earlier this year I think, Canada announced it's going to have an ombudsperson for Canadian businesses overseas, and I stress this is mining, oil and gas, and also textile industries to start off with. Do you see that having a positive impact in terms of behaviour? Maybe I'll ask both Lisa and yourself to comment on that.
Well, I would, again, I think this is sort of with my PDAC hat on. I mean, I think, PDAC clearly is a strong supporter of maintaining Canada as a world leader in responsible mineral exploration practices, and and has been very involved in I think many leading efforts, including things like the E3 Plus, which is I believe the first ever guidance on responsible exploration. So PDAC supports efforts by the Canadian government always to improve responsible business, but I think while PDAC has said that it will work with the government and with other stakeholders in trying to develop the office and the mandate of the ombudsperson. A lot of it, I think, comes down to how it's designed, because while we want to enable effective dispute resolution processes, and there are some already, I would say, we also have to maintain the competitiveness of Canadian players in the industry. And so I think a couple of the things that I personally also have a little bit of trouble with is the fact that, mining, turned out not to be completely singled out. They've added a couple of other industries. But, if you're advocating for something that is supposed to encourage and responsible behavior outside of Canada and redress any issues, I don't know why that should be only for 3 specific industries. So that's one thing that's a little troubling. And then there's a few other things that I think need to be worked out properly, like what triggers the ability to seek the redress of the ombudsperson. The term is significant direct harm, but what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then there's the worry of frivolous or vexatious claims by those who would like to depict the mining industry in a negative light. So overall, great that we can always do better, but how that office is designed, I think, is really important.
Yeah, crucially important, but perhaps a way of how things are moving forward in terms of responsibility and transparency of the industry. And again, transparency builds trust, and the narrative gets better. We've got about 5 minutes left. I'd like to just maybe open up for some questions before I ask for some closing remarks of where you think we'll be in 2030. So, any questions from the audience? Late in the day. Gary, I know that you can't possibly be that quiet. Any questions? Carol? No? Then I shall ask our esteemed panelists maybe just to close off then. Now we'll start with you, Aidan, and then work our way back this way. If you were to sort of push your mind forward in just a few sentences, responsible mining, 2030, what do you think our industry is going to look like, and how is it going to be perceived in society?
Yeah, I guess in some ways I would go back to, and this sounds terribly self-serving, but I will go back to the organisational vision of ICMM, and that is that mining is a respected industry, trusted to act responsibly and to contribute to sustainable development. We recognise that vision is some way off in terms of where we are today, but I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that by 2030 that vision could well be realised. And I think that's because both in terms of the issue around increasingly the expectations around what responsible supply of materials looks like, there's convergence around that. And so I think that is going to bring about a change in perception of the industry. I think secondly, the incredibly powerful role the industry plays today developmentally, both in developing countries but also in developed nations like Canada, I think that's being recognised. And the art of the possible there is not so much being codified, but it's we are seeing more and more examples of constructive collaborations between companies, governments, and civil society organisations. So I think that's a realistic prospect in the next 12 years.
As we'll actually become partners. Right? Good, excellent. Well, thank you very much. And maybe just a quick comment. I mean, even in my own career, when I started, it was a very unsafe industry, and yet now I believe we're safer than the food and beverage industry. So we can change, and we can grow, and we can develop. Sandra?
I think if I were to sort of look down the road, I think the projects will be developed consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think while it's not law in Canada, it has been adopted by our country, and you're going to see that implemented, whether it's through the courts or whether it's through our legislation or policy development. I think we will see that, which means then that projects will have to be developed with the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And if we're moving in that direction, then the impetus is to try to reach agreement with the communities that will outline how the project could be developed. That's to the mutual satisfaction of both parties, but also responsible, socially acceptable, and environmentally safe. Yeah. But just on your last question, dealing with overseas projects and things, for the Indigenous people, the reputation of a company is critical, right? They look into who are they doing business with, and they are very skeptical about companies coming into their territories, let alone companies coming in with bad reputation elsewhere, because the United Nations Forum is not new to them. They make their views known, they make their concerns known, and so to the extent that there are offences and violations in projects dealing with Indigenous populations worldwide, that will affect their perception of a company coming in to do business with them.
And of course, in an increasingly transparent world, you can't hide.
That's exactly right.
Right. So obviously, we're growing strong with the amount of dollars in the industry. So in 2030, how many $1 billion are we going to have annually invested?
Oh my goodness! I hope it's 2 or 3 or 5 times as much. But I do think that certainly we can do things that are consistent with the trends that hopefully will support a positive reputation for the industry, such as being consistent with a low carbon economy. I mean, there's been lots of talk about the materials required for batteries and electric vehicles and all that sort of thing. So certainly being nimble and being able to produce those types of things responsibly. Environmentally, I think we are starting to see more projects use, for instance, like wind power at the mine site instead of lots of diesel. So that's a direction we can move in. And I mean, one thing I mentioned already, but it's a bit of a bee in my bonnet. I'd like to see more progressive diversity practices. I'd like to. It's been demonstrated that more diverse senior management and boards results in better financial outcomes, and I think that the the hundreds of venture exchange companies really sort of have not turned their attention to moving the dial on that. So I think that's going to happen, and I think that's probably it for me.
Yep, no, very, very good. And I couldn't agree more with you, by the way. We essentially have excluded half of our population from the mining industry, say 10 or 15%. And I think if we move to 2030 and it's gender equal, I think that would be a marvellous achievement in a trusted community that's being led by global leaders. So with that, thank you very much. If you'd like to join me just in thanking our esteemed panelists, thank you.